Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is James Essegbey, and I would like to welcome you to the panel in Conversation, Historical and Political Stakes. Our panelists are Dr. Abena Asare and Dr. Agustin Lao-Montes. Dr. Abena Asare is Assistant Professor of Modern African Affairs and History. Her research spans questions of diaspora, human rights, and transitional justice in Africa and the African diaspora. Dr. Asare's work focuses on the importance of marginalized histories when contemplating questions of African social and political progress. She has published in both policy-focused and academic journals. Dr. Asare is the author of Truth Without Reconciliation, a Human Rights History of Ghana, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2018. Dr. Agustin Lao-Montes has a PhD in sociology from the State University of New York, Binghamton. His fields of specialty include world historical sociology and globalization, political sociology, especially social movements and the sociology of state and nationalism, social identities and social inequalities, sociology of race and ethnicity, urban sociology, community university partnerships, African diaspora and Latino studies, sociology of culture and cultural studies, and contemporary theory and post-colonial critique. Dr. Lao-Montes' book, Diasporic Counterpointings, Political Cartographies of Our Afro-America, is published in Spanish by the Universidad del Externado in Colombia, and an English version will be published soon. I hand over to the panelists. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Abena Asare, and I am Associate Professor of Africana Studies and History at SUNY, Stony Brook University. My paper today is entitled What to Do About the Country, Thinking About Home and Nation with Chinua Achebe and James Baldwin in the year 2020. At the hearing of my voice, we, in our different locations, are grappling with the United States' descent into an abyss of our nation's collective making, albeit not of our collective desire. It is unclear whether liberation or justice is still on the menu in these here United States, or whether we are in a season of retrenchment, a time to watch, wait, hoard local power, and ultimately survive. What to do about the country? To navigate this question, I turn to Chinua Achebe and James Baldwin, two 20th century writers who, throughout their lifetimes, wrestled with the inadequacy, the disappointment of the nation state as a vehicle for securing Black freedom, both on the political and the intimate planes. For both Achebe and Baldwin, their country's inability to deliver freedom to the human beings within the borders was a point of deep disappointment. Both men exposed and mourned their nation's tendency to function as a vehicle for the reproduction of political, social, economic, emotional, and psychological violence against marginalized individuals and groups. Sound familiar? For both, the question of how to wear the cloth of their respective national identities while walking toward freedom was consistent. Each would return again and again to this question throughout his life. Of course, their respective countries were different. There were different hopes, expectations, histories, and resources associated with the United States in the last decades of the 20th century and post-independence Nigeria in that same time period. The ambivalence that each maintained toward his home country and toward the nation-state form more generally was different in genesis and function. James Baldwin's aversion to U.S. nationalism was blunt, scathing. He described his country as, quote, a sunlit playpen in which so many citizens lose first their identities and then their minds, unquote. To continue quoting Baldwin, forays, frontiers, and flags, all were utterly useless. Achebe's critique of Nigeria was no less sharp, but he was more circumspect. In today's circumstances, Achebe noted, bearing a Nigerian passport might not sound altogether like an unqualified piece of good news, but I have never thought it was, which is precisely what it means to have my work cut out for me, unquote. Both Baldwin and Achebe lived, wrote, and thought freedom askew and apart from the limits of the nation state. They had to. Their countries had exiled them, made war upon them, slandered them, disabled them, and disillusioned them. In so doing, they're models for us in this time when we each must individually and collectively decide what to do about the country. What do we hold on to when looking to the future? Where is the arena in which we should struggle for justice? How do we walk the line of nationalist imaginary in a country that is sliding toward fascism? The iconic meeting of Baldwin and Achebe in 1980 at the University of Florida, the event that we have come together to commemorate, offers lessons about the estrangement of diaspora, the failures of the nation state, and where freedom's home is when you live and create askew from the nation state. This meeting in Gainesville is a lesson for our time about how to wear the cloth of national identity in difficult moments. But before we get to Gainesville in 1980, we must contend with the nation. James Baldwin's United States, like our own, was a settler state, a country located upon stolen land and built by stolen labor that nonetheless, to Baldwin's chagrin, insisted on its innocence. Quote, the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I, nor time, nor history will ever forgive them, Baldwin wrote in The Fire Next Time, is that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds and thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it, unquote. From the moment that James Baldwin arrived into the world, a poor, Black, gay, male child in Harlem, the chasm between the country's rhetoric and its reality were made plain in his life and body. Observing this chasm swallow his father and threaten countless others, including himself, Baldwin was fixed as an outsider in the country of his birth. The outsider, as it were, can hardly be a good nationalist. The promise and comforts of nationalism elude him, knowing as he does that they tend to mask the suffering, exploitation, and exclusion of himself and others. When a group gathers round the flag, the outsider is attuned to those beyond the door, shivering, the person for whom the flag's value is less than the cloth from which it was sewn. Accordingly, Baldwin thought, lived, and dreamed aslant and askew from an American national identity. He famously had to leave his country, regularly and often in order to write. Exile was a mode of survival, a way to hold space for and fan the flames of his gift. Just 3 years before his soul flew from his body, James Baldwin reflected on the bitter lesson of his years under the American flag. Quote, "What has happened in the time of my time is the record of my ancestors. No promise was kept with them, no promise was kept with me. Nor can I counsel those coming after me, nor my global kinsmen, to believe a word uttered by my morally bankrupt and desperately dishonest countrymen." Unquote. From cradle to grave, James Baldwin looked with narrow eyes, an increasingly despairing voice, at the United States. Now, Chinua Achebe's relationship with Nigeria was also complicated. Achebe wrote, lived, and thought in between the village and the world. His work was simultaneously hyper-local and cosmic in scale. For Achebe, Nigeria was a tether and a center. His wish, in his own words, was never to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land. His intention was to write Nigeria, to fix Nigeria, to teach Nigeria, but his own life story and his work unfolded in the space beyond the borders of his home country. His 1983 pamphlet, The Trouble with Nigeria, speaks about the failures of the post-independence African nation and the need to staunch the flow before it is too late. Like most other texts written in this vein, Achebe here is in pursuit of a, quote, modern and attractive country, unquote, that has not yet been the fruit of independence, but which he believes could be made real. It is not too late, Chinua Achebe insists, to set the nation on course. 30 years later, things have shifted for Achebe. In There Was a Country, a book written after his car accident, after his partial paralysis, after it was clear that exile was not merely a sojourn, but itself a destination, Achebe's insistence that Nigeria can be redeemed, that, quote, our condition is not totally bereft of hope, unquote, has shifted. The dream animating this book is not the future redemption of Nigeria, but a memory of a ghost country, a place that existed briefly and by and large in the hearts and minds of its people, many of them dead. Biafra. When the prospect of national redemption fades into the mist, or the timeline to true reform seems to extend too long, Achebe flies to the realm of memory, a ghost country that decidedly was not Nigeria and ultimately was stillborn. Throughout his life, Achebe was attuned to the nourishment and the power that come from home and from belonging. My home, Achebe says, was not merely a house or a town, but an awakening story in whose ambiance my own existence had first begun to assemble its fragments into coherence and meaning. Unquote. For Achebe, Nigeria, the nation, had burned him, scarred him, disabled him, exiled him. But finally, he had to reconstruct his vision of home to something simultaneously more expansive and more specific than the country of birth. This type of reconstruction was also part of the process for James Baldwin. When Chinua Achebe and James Baldwin met for the first time in 1980 at the African Literature Association conference in Gainesville, they had already long been meeting in the realm of the mind. Their paths as writers, intellectuals, and visionaries had been crisscrossing, looping, and weaving and circling one another for years. That strange evening in Florida, as Achebe described it, was the culmination of years of longing and communing across great distances of geography, experience, politics, and artistic striving. In 1963, 17 years before they met in Florida, Chinua Achebe had hoped to meet James Baldwin, this man whose books, quote, blew his mind, as part of his first trip to the United States. As part of a UNESCO tour, Achebe had specifically asked to meet this man with the fearlessness of Old Testament prophets and the clarity, eloquence, and intelligence of ancient African griots. Unfortunately, Baldwin was not around. He had traveled. And this was true throughout Baldwin's life. His deep and violent entanglement with the United States meant that he was often not around. Close to the time when Chinua Achebe was looking for James Baldwin in the United States, James Baldwin was moving through Israel, France, Switzerland, and Turkey looking for Africa. That is to say, Baldwin was wrestling with the limits of the nation state and national identity in his own pursuit of freedom. Late in 1961, James Baldwin accepted an assignment from The New Yorker to travel to Africa and the Middle East to explore emergent Francophile West African nations. Now, Baldwin never managed to write this article as such. The letters he sent to his editors and friends in 1961 and 1962 offer some insight into some of the possible reasons why. Quote, "My bones know somehow something of what awaits me in Africa," unquote, Baldwin wrote from Israel in October 1961. "That is one of the reasons I have dawdled so long. I'm afraid." What might James Baldwin have to fear from so-called Africa? "It would be nice to be able to dream about Africa," Baldwin wrote, "but once I have been there, I will not be able to dream anymore." Upon arrival on African soil, bright illusions about the continent as a site of recognition and succor might and probably would shatter, Baldwin intimated, and he would be required to speak of this dissolution. How could he bear this? And how could he bring this news back to Black folk in the U.S.? Contrary to Chinua Achebe's reflection that Baldwin was not scared of anybody or anything, he was not even scared of Africa, this was what Achebe wrote about Baldwin after Baldwin's death. Baldwin himself, at one point in his life, registered his fright and said so. "The complexity of diaspora, the turbulent depths running underneath County Cullen's simple question, 'What is Africa to me?' also troubled the brilliant James Baldwin." By 1980, when they met in Florida, much had occurred in both men's lives since the years when Achebe was looking for Baldwin and James Baldwin was searching for Africa and for home. If they hadn't met before, it was because of these cycles of going and coming, the migrations and turnings made necessary by the brokenness of their respective nation states. Baldwin was a man always on the move, finding a way to write and live and earn and breathe. Achebe was also moving, pulled across oceans and continents by academic grants, teaching jobs, warscapes behind, and opportunity in front. This meeting, the fact that it had not occurred earlier, the fact that it occurred at all, was a function of diaspora. And when they met in the flesh, James Baldwin was greeted exuberantly by Chinua Achebe, who uttered a literary pun. "Mr. Baldwin, I presume." Immediately, the listener would hear the echo of Joseph Conrad's famous line, "Mr. Kurtz, I presume," from the dehumanizing classic Heart of Darkness. The listener would also hear another reference, this time to Chinua Achebe's iconic text eviscerating Conrad's deeply racist rendering of Africa. This text entitled "An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness." What rich diasporic literary language is this? Upon meeting these layers of history, representation, and struggle that both these men spent their lives sifting through, are conjured up in a single sharp utterance. Later on, in his public remarks, James Baldwin reciprocated in kind when he recognized Achebe as his buddy, a brother he had not seen in 400 years. Now, in Achebe's telling, the attending crowd erupted into gleeful applause at the poignancy of this quip. Very few people heard what he called the terrible aside that followed. "It was never intended that we should meet." This, of course, was a reference to the ruptures created by 400 plus years of slavery, empire, and the worlds that these processes wrought. Alongside this claim of transatlantic fraternity, there is a swift current of loneliness, a quote, keen homelessness, in the words of Baldwin. "What did I ever do to deserve so ghastly a birthplace?" Baldwin cried out while in Israel in 1961. So of course, there was joy at this meeting, the joy of finding each other again, despite the historical ruptures that erect silos of nationhood around Black lives and Black freedom. Brothers indeed, despite the passports, the currencies, the power and lack thereof associated with different national identities. Suddenly, a voice interrupts the conversation, a male voice intruding over the PA system, the original Zoom bombing. "You gonna have to cut it out, Mr. Baldwin. We can't stand for this kind of going on." The shocked audience holds its breath for a moment. Finally, James Baldwin speaks clearly into the mic again. Mr. Baldwin is nevertheless going to finish his statement, and I will tell you now, whoever you are, that if you assassinate me in the next 2 minutes, I'm telling you this: it no longer matters what you think. The doctrine of white supremacy on which the Western world is based has had its hour, has had its day. It's over. What else is this trembling assertion, if not an echo of Chinua Achebe's wistful sigh? There was a country. James Baldwin insists that white supremacy has had its day at the cusp of the Reagan era in 1980. And at that moment, we see the shadow of a ghost country, a place that exists apart from the confines of our present moment. There is a place, there was a country, there is a home apart from and despite the constraints of the nation state. This is the task in this year 2020, reconstructing the meaning of home so that we may be nourished and have the power that comes from place and belonging, despite the failures of our nation state. In this work, we must find our siblings around the world, brothers and sisters and folks we haven't seen in 400 years and whom we were never intended to meet.
Well, my name is Agustin Lao. I teach sociology and Afro-American studies at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. I want to say thank you and congratulations to African Studies and Latin American Studies at the University of Florida at Gainesville for organizing this very important gallery. My presentation is called The Colonial Counterpoint on Africana Beat, a dialogue between Achebe and Baldwin. As we speak, there is a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst, where I co-direct the graduate certificate in African Diaspora Studies. Chino Achebe taught intermittently in our department between 1972 and 1988, while James Baldwin was affiliated to it from 1983 to 1987, the last 4 years of his life. On December 16, 1987, a couple of weeks after James Baldwin passed, Chino Achebe gave a speech at a funeral held at UMass Amherst for the recently deceased Black American writer. In Achebe's intervention at Baldwin's UMass Memorial, eventually publishing his book of essays, hopes, and impediments, he talks about how their lives crossed. Achebe tells that when he traveled to the Americas for the first time in 1963 and visited Brazil and the US, the two countries with the largest populations of the African diaspora in the continent, was disappointed he was not able to see Baldwin, a writer he admired and really wanted to meet. They met in 1980 in a meeting of a conference of the Association of African Literature. Achebe describes the encounter as a miraculous experience where he was unprepared for the Baldwin phenomenon that brought a new sharpness of vision, a new energy of passion, a new perfection of language to battle the incubus of race. He recalls that him and Baldwin opened the conference with a public conversation where within minutes a mystery voice came over the public address system and began to hurl racial insults to him and me. And Soletny said, "I will see that moment to the end of my life." Achebe compared Baldwin to Marxist African leader Thomas Sankara, himself a recent victim of political assassination, because both challenged the consciousness of white Western powers and did not allow them to rest in peace. He potently closed his memorial address saying, "We must consider how much more dangerous our already very perilous world will become if the oppressed everywhere should despair altogether of invoking reason and humanity to arbitrate their cause. This is the value and the relevance into the foreseeable future of James Baldwin. As long as there are oppressions, the words of James Baldwin will be there to bear witness and to inspire and elevate the struggle for human freedom. This predicament, to write and fight for the humanity of African peoples as a pivot of liberation in the whole planet, is the principal tie that binds these two champions of Black thought, literature, and politics." This brief presentation will rehearse a dialogue between Achebe and Baldwin as the Colonial Intellectuals, a counterpoint in light of their different yet interweaved locations in the African world. For this, I will draw from their essays collected in two books, Notes of a Native Song by James Baldwin and Home and Exile by Chino Achebe. Even though they were published in different moments, Notes of a Native Song in 1955 and Home and Exile based on lectures delivered at Harvard University in 1998, they both address questions of homelessness, exile, return, diaspora, identity, memory, and the character of Afrikaner writing as critical intervention against white Western domination. It is in this sense that, using today's language, I am naming them as decolonial intellectual activists. Using the language of the long 60s, circa 1955-1975, which is the period when they emerged as key intellectual and political figures in the context of world historical transformation, it may be more adequate to call them the two most representative writers of the anti-colonial, anti-racist politics of the times, between the Bandung moment and the movement for black freedom centered in the African continent, the Caribbean, and the United States. As such, Baldwin and Achebe can be called beacons of liberation. In Notes of a Native Song, Baldwin situated himself as an Afro-American. I was born in Harlem 31 years ago. The most difficult and the most rewarding thing in my life has been the fact that I was born a Negro, and I was forced, therefore, to effect some kind of truth upon this reality. The Negro problem is nearly inaccessible. I was forced to recognize that I was a kind of bastard to the West. When I followed the line of my past, I did not find myself in Europe, but in Africa. That big, invoking Shakespeare's dialectic of Prospero and Caliban, unveiling the imperial underpinnings of anti-black racism, he contends, the conundrum of color is the inheritance of every American. The civilized have never been able to honor, recognize, or describe the savage. Playing this drum in Hegelian key, in tune with Cesar, Du Bois, and Fanon, Baldwin writes, it must be remembered that the oppressed and the oppressors are bound together within the same society. The dehumanization of the Negro then is indivisible from the dehumanization of ourselves. The loss of our identity is the price we paid for the annulment of his fruitless tension between the traditional master and slaves, thus deconstructing the double alienation of the Negro, on his word, from his own people and from us, to expose naked the labyrinth of being made a Negro and the contradictions of white racism. Those are quotes from Baldwin. Baldwin's own rendition of the dialectic between master and slaves, colonizer and colonized, as a substratum of anti-black racism, and in the same stroke of a foundation to double consciousness, articulate his deep critique of Western racism that informs a robust decolonial politics of liberation. In the essay Encounter on the Scene, Black Meets Brown, Baldwin builds on his view of the relation between American Negro and the continental Africa. He talks about the ambivalence of the American Negro in Paris, who can partly escape from the everyday violence of anti-black racism in the US, while being both hyper-visible and invisible in France. On this note, he writes, the ambivalence of his status is thrown into relief by his encounters with the Negro from France colonies who live in Paris. The French African comes from a region and a way of life which, at least from the American point of view, is exceedingly primitive and where exploitation takes more naked form. End quote. In Counterpoint, he argues, quote, in Paris, the African Negro status, conspicuous and subtly inconvenient, is that of a colonial, and he lives where the intangibly precarious life of his own collection, returning to my ancestral home for the first time. Achebe goes on to describe his belonging to an Igbo Nation, an historical people grounded in pre-colonial Africa. In the first lecture, titled My Home Under the Imperial Fire, Achebe does a sort of thick description of his re-encounter with his Igbo groundings after living in the city. Talks about music, spirituality, daily life, family and communal relations, a world with its own internal tensions and contradictions, overdetermined by the context of colonial rule. That we counterpoint to Baldwin's narrative of Harlem, where the beauty of community life is stained by a repertoire of violences, from the anti-black racism of the American metropolis to black internecine strife. Achebe highlights the communal character of Igbo's form of government, where everybody speaks his own mouth in popular assembly, performing political subjectivities that make them serious Democrats. As a polity, the Igbo Nation is presented as hundreds of autonomous villages and towns, so deeply suspicious of political amalgamation against centralized military power, where a threat of anarchy, always attendant on the Igbo choice of political organization, crept closer and closer to realization as the devastation of the Atlantic slave trade reached further and further into the heartland. End quote. Achebe releases this radical democratic relates this radical democratic tradition to his metaphor of immemorial anxiety, of anarchy and incommensurability with British imperial and Western nation-state reason presented in Things Fall Apart. To a large extent, Home and Exile is a memoir of the rise in consciousness of the African writer as a decolonial intellectual, as such an anti-imperial, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist world historical actor. Achebe tells a story about how he became a decolonial writer from gaining consciousness of imperial power through narrative in studying Joyce Gary's Mr. Johnson's novel in school, up to reading racism in Conrad's novel, to counterpointing Western domination with the power of telling our own stories. On this note, he says, Mr. Johnson made me aware that my home was under attack, not only my town, but my world and its narrative. Achebe ties this power of literature and literature of power to the very inception of modernity and the slave trade from an African continent standpoint. Quote, European trade in slaves was destined by its very profitability to displace trade in commodities to West Africa. The belief in African inferiority was already in full bloom. End quote. Hence, in this Western imperial tale, quote, Africa as men in chains to an abundance of literature tale to explain or justify the spectacle, a literature of devaluation emerged where the enslaving and repatriation of Africans was represented as a blessing that delivered the poor wretch from a worse fate in their homeland. End quote. Nevertheless, he argues that at this juncture, the primary discourse and politics of resistance was not contra racism, but against empire. On this key, he writes, quote, any white person who did not believe in self-rule for us was simply called an imperialist. In contrast to Baldwin's bold yet nuanced consciousness of the ubiquity of white racism as a cornerstone of modernity itself, Achebe says, quote, eager though we were to get rid of white rule, we did not find it necessary to demonize white people, at least not at that stage. And the reason I think is that we were ignorant of the hundreds of years of sustained denigration we and our home had been subjected to make our colonization possible and excusable, end quote. Further revealing such complexities on his road to become a decolonial writer, Achebe affirms that a white-black British-Nigerian divide frames the rise of the African novel in the 1950s as the signals of the long last to end Europe's imposition of a derogatory narrative of Africa, a narrative designed to call African humanity into questions, which means that new ways to write about Africa have appeared, reinventing the continent and its people with humanity, end quote. At this profoundly radical anti-racist juncture, Achebe meets Baldwin in their deep denunciation from different locations in the African world of the evils of anti-black racism as a major impediment to the humanization of humanity. To take the challenge formulated by Achebe, quote, not for a rehash of the old stereotypes which gained currency long ago in the slave trade and poisoned, perhaps forever, the wellspring of our common humanity, end quote. On his part, Baldwin never lose track, as he said in a lecture April 18, 1984 at UMass-Amherst, that, quote, what has happened in the time of my time is the record of my ancestor, global kinsmen, end quote. The joint legacy of both giants of decolonial horizons of liberation is eloquently stated in Achebe's closing words at Baldwin's memorial, that now also apply to Achebe as griot and wise ancestor. As long as there are oppressions, the words of James Baldwin, and I will add, of Chinua Achebe, will be there to bear witness and to inspire and elevate the struggle for human freedom. Thank you very much.